Afternoon, amazing people here at DDD Perth. It is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Anton Ball. He's talking to us today about superhero layouts, so I hope we get a few superhero poses from him. He is a front-end developer, speaker and community organiser, including here at DDD Perth. He's passionate about clean and structured code, web standards, accessibility, and optimisation. And Anton prides himself on delivering robust, high quality, and beautiful solutions. Anton co-organises Fenders Front-End Developer meetups and, as I said, DDD Perth. He's also volunteered as a mentor, introducing others into this wonderful world that is coding. Take it away, Anton.
Cool. So, thanks everyone for coming along. I've got the sponsor slides up there, so that's good that they help us to have this event for a pretty great price, really. So I'm going to be talking about superhero layouts. Comics are said to have passed through 4 ages, with each of the ages known to have something distinctive about it. In the Golden Age, we were first introduced to the superhero archetype. This was around about 1938 or so. This was our introduction to characters like Superman, Wonder Woman, and Batman. During the Silver Age, the world is recovering from a world war, and readers had matured during that time. So to meet that maturity, the stories were focused on horror, crime, and romance more than what they were before. This sort of helped the industry to survive through what was a difficult period. After the Silver Age, many of those heroic storylines that the writers could think of were used. So they decided instead, through the Bronze Age, to tackle the social issues of the day. This would include bigotry, racism, and substance abuse. And the modern age is a time of redesign, growth, and some disruption by the web. Anyone can publish now, bringing more unique stories and making comics more accessible to audiences than ever thought possible. No longer was it about a couple of those major players that were creating or publishing comics. And so what makes comics an absorbing storytelling medium is that, along with great characters, stories, and art styles, is the impact that the layout can have on that story. And we're going to explore each of the ages of comics and how it relates to web layout and how CSS Grid, combined with some other CSS techniques, can be used to recreate these layouts. And as you're looking at these, they're obviously very comic book focused, but think about how you can reimagine the techniques that I'm talking about here for the use in your layouts and projects that you're working on. And I'm not going to dive too much into responsiveness. I think there's a lot of great articles that cover that with Grid already. But it is possible to do so, and there's a short part here where I will cover it. So those comic book ages that I went through spanned about 70 years, and 70 years is a fairly long time to be able to evolve a storytelling medium. By comparison, our industry, the web, is still relatively young. HTML is about 29 years old, and CSS is 25. And that makes me older than both of them, unfortunately. Not combined, but that's still okay. So the web is, after all, young, and so if anyone else is older than them, so are we. But the point I'm getting at to here is, in a relatively short period of time, layout on the web progressed through many ages of its own. We started off with just HTML. This was the text, links, basic elements. We sort of co-opted tables to do what they weren't really meant to do, and we started using them for layouts. The first of our comic book crossovers, Flash, came along, gave us very dynamic layouts, but it had its own problems. And we've been going through absolute, float, responsive, and I think we're kind of heading into the intrinsic era, which is a term that I've seen Jen Simmons coin. And it's talking more about letting the devices define the layout a bit more. We have foldable phones, we have fridges, all sorts of things. So all that in 29 short years, less than half of that of our friends in the comic industry. So it can be really tempting at times to give layout on the web a hard time. But given the relatively young age that our industry is, I think it's amazing how far we've progressed. And we can certainly appreciate what we have now when you consider where it is that we've come from. So is the current age of the web going to be considered the web's modern age? And with CSS Grid, I think that might just be the case. So before I jump too much into code, this is me, Anton Ball. I'm local here to Perth, and I've always kind of brought my daughter along to these events, so you might see me rocking around with her a little bit more later. And as you know, I'm older than HTML and CSS. I'm a full stack team lead at Doist. We make Todoist and Twist applications. You can find me on Twitter at AntonJB if you want to. And perhaps this is extra information at this point, but I quite enjoy comics. So undoubtedly one of the most important comics in history is Action Comics #1. This was, as I said, released around 1938. And what makes it an important comic in the history of all comics is it's the introduction of Superman. And just so we're all clear, that's him holding the car up there. Now, Superman has changed a lot through the years, but this is where they started. The layout throughout the comics, and others even in the Golden and Silver Age, consisted primarily of rows of squares and rectangles. If we look at a few of the pages from the comic, we can see that pattern in use. We'll have a couple of squares, a larger rectangle with the art in it. But what we are focused on is layout. So I'm going to strip out the imagery and see what we are left with. The pattern was 1 to 3 panels per row staggered throughout the page with a somewhat consistent gap. It was printed, so, somewhat consistent. In terms of CSS Grid, it's a nice starting off point. We might think that we can do grid template rows and sort of repeat 3 times over one fraction, but we need to go a little bit further if we want to achieve the staggering that we can hopefully see here. Can you actually see the staggering? Can you see the grey squares? I suspect not. All right. So the way I calculated the columns is to measure the smallest panel on the layout and divide that by the width of the comic. So the smallest panel would be between 2 gaps there that you can see. We aren't using that size, but it gives us the basis with which to work from. So between 2 panels, there's there. Don't worry, more colour comes in later. So when we divide the page width, which is 576, by the 36, which is the smallest panel we could possibly do, that gives us the total number of columns we would want to recreate this layout. Importantly, it's the same aspect ratio as the printed version. So turning that into grid, we have display grid, grid template columns repeat 16 times over one fraction. And the grid gap, we can be super consistent now because we're in the web. So we don't need grid template rows in this example because we can rely on the implicit grid to handle that for us. And so what do I mean by the implicit grid? If we were to fill up all of the contents along that first defined grid, Grid will automatically add a new track to the row underneath, which will fill up with those columns as well. And by default, the implicit grid tracks are automatically sized. We can start controlling that if we want to with grid auto rows or grid auto columns. But for the purposes of our demo, we're happy for the grid to just keep repeating over as we use it. And each panel can then span the number of columns required there. So panel 1 spans across 6, panel 2 spans across 5, and we start to get the layout of our grid with the staggering. So there we go. We've created a comic layout with only a few lines of CSS. And the staggering is a nice touch to avoid being too symmetrical in layout. We never want it being all the same. But while it's not much code for a lot of possibilities, we aren't really feeling like superheroes just yet. So the layout in Action Comic 1 didn't play a huge role in the story itself. So it's more used as a container, and that was about it. So let's instead jump forward to the Bronze Age, which brings with it a change in how layout did become a part of the story. Spider-Man 121 was released around 1973 and considered a pivotal point in this character's sort of story arc and their history. Now, I hope it's not a spoiler for something from 1973, but this is the death of Gwen Stacy, which if you've seen any of the movies lately, you're probably familiar with it. We can talk about it later. So what's great about this story, along with the moment artwork, and everything involved is the way that the layout became an integral part of its telling. The height of the bridge and the fall is shown beautifully through those spanning panels. You wouldn't get that sense of height or danger from the grid if it was like the previous example, all running along several rows. So even though it's a great moment in there, let's again strip out the artwork and see the layout in use. So the big difference is the panel spanning multiple rows. This is one of the areas where Grid has given us a sense of a modern layout. We're no longer are we constrained to a single axis. And the way that I determined the panels was done as the same in the previous one. This time though we have 23. So we're still able to rely on implicit grid, even though we're spanning multiple rows now, because grid will allow us to do that. So we add in panel 1, we span across 9, like we did before, but now we can span down 3 rows, and grid will handle that. Panel 2 will span across 7, panel 3 will be whatever the rest of 23 minus 9 and 7 is, and then panel 4 will just slide into place there. Grid gives us a lot of things for free, which is nice. And we're able to now cover a great many of the layouts during and up to the Bronze Age. So next up in the journey through the ages is Watchmen, which is famous for many reasons, like the movie, but it kicked off the modern age of comics. Now, Watchmen adhered to a strict 9-panel grid throughout its run, which means what we've created so far would essentially cover this whole comic book or the series. So there's hundreds of possibilities with a 9-panel grid, which is not me recommending everyone go out and do that. It just means that it's very powerful. But there was a panel from Watchmen that I wanted to recreate. It did something just a little bit outside the box with grid. Now the panel in the middle there, there's a lot going on with the speech bubbles, but the artwork you can see is the same image running across the 3 panels. It's not just constrained into one anymore. Now, we could split the image into 3 if we wanted to. It would make it quite easy. But I think it's better if we can recreate the effect while we maintain the image. It'll give us some flexibility. So if we want to swap the image out later, we're only going to have to do the 1 and not remember all the various steps in cutting them up into 3. Or if we want to work with some responsiveness, which we'll see in this one. So the setup here is similar to what we had before. We're aiming to have the image remain intact while we add the gap in there. So panel 3, which is in the middle, we are going to wrap that in another grid. So we have our main grid laid out like we have before, and panel 3 has a grid in there as well. And it's spanning multiple columns, so we have room enough to place the gap. Now, only the direct children of a container can become grid items, but with Subgrid, we're able to inherit the rows or columns from the parent element. Now that's what happens here when we add Subgrid onto the overlap area. So we'll look at it without the image to try and better understand what's happening. Overlap is pulling in the rows from the main comic itself with that Subgrid. But we don't, if the columns in the main comic one were to change, if we were to add more or change it to be a different ratio, then the subpanel or overlap, would inherit that. So we're getting that just for free. But we don't have to inherit the whole grid. In this case, we can set our own rows in there as well. So we can only inherit what we want and leave the rest out. Now why that might be useful is if we were to say add the speech bubbles in. We're going to have a better chance of positioning them on the page. So putting the graphics back, it's time to achieve the gap in there. We do this with a pseudo element. We add that to the overlap container in there. We give it the same graphic visuals as the outline. So we give it the same grid gap and the same colouring. I've just used a custom property there just to kind of give an example of how that could be easier. And put it into place. And so there we go. That's ticked off our goal of maintaining the image while simulating a grid gap. Now, if we wanted, say for mobile, for a little bit of responsiveness, we could drop that gap off and just have the whole image there, if we were thinking outside of just comics here. So Subgrid is a great next step for grid. Anytime you've struggled to align items without setting the height across multiple panels, And I'm sure if you've ever done front-end, you've probably had those 3 panels, and there'll be some headings on the top and some content in the middle, and some of them will have like only a tiny bit of text, and then the other one's like a short novel, and they all get stretched out. So with Subgrid, we'll start to be able to inherit across rows or across columns and keep them consistent. This is an example from the Todoist website where we run into this. So I've used the German language here because they're always good for like long words that you can test with these areas. So if we set height, we run the risk of cutting the text off or having that overlap. If we set a minimum height, well, then we have the weird sort of thing where, well, now the buttons aren't lining up. And if you have the designs, they typically will line up. So we have that problem. So grid and subgrid are going to have us covered. If the middle content was to grow, the others will grow in all 3 panels. It'll be very handy. And the advantage over the flat grid setup is we get the flexibility of the expanding rows while we get to maintain the semantic relationship of each of the elements. Each one can be in its own semantic div or whatever it may be, and we're covered. But where's browser support at with Subgrid? Not great. We're still a little bit in experimental territory here, and that's okay. You can still sometimes use it. The only browser with Subgrid sort of fully implemented is Firefox, as in released. And they actually did it all the way back in 2019, the day after I gave this talk once, they did it. Now, Safari recently enabled Subgrid in the technical preview. That's why I said Firefox is the only one. But it's in there, which means by the next versions of Safari, we'll start to see Subgrid. But there is hope in all of this. Subgrid has been included in Interop 2022. Which is a combined effort by browser vendors and people that also write code for supporting web standards to close the gap in some of these CSS features. So they are all going to basically work towards having Subgrid implemented and passing the same test so that it is displayed correctly across all of the browsers. Before that, though, and before Subgrid is more widely available, we can recreate this effect with display content. So we've added that to overlap, and essentially what it does is gets rid of that container in there and lifts the items up into the parent grid, which is our comic. We do lose the semantic meaning, though, which is why I think Subgrid is going to be a better option for us. If we had some very specific semantic meaning by adding the display contents, it's gone. So that can be a bit of a problem. Now, it's the next evolution during the modern age of comics where layout really gets creative and interesting. We're revisiting the world of Spider-Man here. We'll do that a few times because he's a bit of a favourite of mine. But we started to see a new trend in this age of comics. This modern age brought with it layering panels to achieve a flow and depth that we hadn't previously seen. Artists were able to focus in and provide little detail elements without taking up all the space that others had. Now, layering is certainly not new to the web, but Grid enables us to layer in much easier and predictable ways than with the previous option. So let's take a look at some of the code. We have display grid, we have grid template columns, and then we have all these numbers. And it's like, wow, yeah, that's so much easier than what it was before. But here's how I figured it out. And if you have the artwork, that can be useful, which we often do from our friends in design, or if you design yourself. And we'll focus on the rows. So the number of rows that we have is 9. We have 9 that we want to place out in here. Now, this is starting to look like a similar trend. If we divide the height by the number of rows, we get a base for 1 fraction unit. So we can do this with one of the panels as well. We can use that as 1 fraction. But this is the way that I kind of went for it. So next we divide the height of an individual row by that base fraction. So 291 is the row we want, 109 is the base unit that we're using, and that gives us 2.6 fraction units. So what are these fraction units and why do we keep using them in Grid? They give us a bit more flexibility when we need to make everything responsive and maintain the aspect ratio. And also, if you can't really use percentages because we have the gap value in Grid as well. And if you use percentages with gaps, things will start to get weird and overlap. But if we use the fractions, it's going to stick within those bounds, and the gaps will also help to stick it in there. Or they will work together with gap rather than against it. And we repeat that same process to determine the columns. So there we go. That's how we got to all those numbers. Now we can then layer our panels over the top where needed using grid row and grid column values. So our panel 3, which has the young lady in it, we have grid row 4 to 7 and grid column 5, span 1, and z-index just to bring it up onto the top. Now panel 4, we have grid row 5 through to 9, so we're saying from 5 to 9. But interestingly, we have grid column 2 to -2. So where does this -2 come from in here? The grid lines, each of the lines in a grid, are numbered 1 through to n. In our case, that's 8, the total number of lines that we have. So the starting line for panel 4 is 2. We wanted it a little bit in. But those lines are also numbered in reverse. So from what would be our typical reading order, from the right is -1 through to -n, or 8. So if we want to finish up 2 lines in, we can use -2. The benefit of that is when inevitably our design changes later on, if more lines were to be added into the middle, we don't have to update everywhere that we do it. If we said span to the distance we want, and then we add something new, well then now we have to go and update everything. So as long as we're not changing that too much, it will adjust with the grid. It can be pretty handy. And most of the browser dev tools will show you these numbers. In this case, it's Firefox, but you can inspect the element and typically you can turn on line numbers, line names, and other properties like that. So the modern age have made prolific use of this layering. This is another example of Hawkeye. And it can be a great way to finally break out of the boxes that have contained us in design and layout for so many years. Here's the web recreation on the other side that I've done. And we're not using gap here, we're just adding some borders so that we can, because grid can't do sort of funky gaps like that, but we can overlay each of them on there and then start to add some borders and create some real interesting depth into some of our designs. But with great power comes great responsibility. To keep with the theme of what I'm doing, layering is an exciting addition to our layout toolboxes, but we do have to consider more than just the layout it opens up to us. There's an inherent danger here when you can just position something anywhere on the page. If the source order isn't created in a way that makes sense, you can negatively impact the accessibility of your project. So as an example, if we decided that the panel 4 was better up the top, we can just do that. We can move it with grid. But solely changing the visual layout is not going to tell the browser that the source order has changed. So a screen reader might come in and start to go through that information by going the first sort of few images to the girl to the field, whereas we've now changed the visual order to field and then the other things going down. So that's something that we need to be careful of. To avoid falling into this trap, there's a few things that we can do. We can look at the structure of our document first and make sure that we're layering it out in HTML order correctly. We can then create the grid that supports that, and then, like any hero, be vigilant and maintain that order when you are working on these. A really good place to start reading into grid accessibility is MDM's layout and accessibility guide that they have on the article, on the website, sorry. So a common criticism of web design and layout is that everything is within a box. You may have heard it, sort of the reference to bootstrap layouts or maybe a little bit of those libraries that have helped us work fast, but have reduced some of the creativity that we're able to get from these frameworks. And so far, looking at a lot of these comics, we have some layering, but everything is still a box. Now for comics, boxy layout started to change during the modern age of comics. The characters broke out of their boxes, and the storytelling once again evolved with them. Now this is a nice example from Phoenix and Jean Grey, showing how different shapes can enhance the storytelling and our recreated example alongside it. So that is running, and it is a valid website. So fundamentally, everything within a grid is still going to be a box. We can't do random shapes like this. But we can combine our boxes with some new techniques and get a bit creative and give the illusion of almost any shape that we like. So there's a little bit of boilerplate in this. We're setting up our comic to contain everything. We've got position relative because we're going to do some absolute positioning and floating, and things are going to get weird. So we've got overflow hidden on there as well to make sure nothing escapes. We want it to break out of the box, but not too far. We want to keep it in there. Now the panels grids has a column for each of our 5 panels, and they're just regular panels going along like we've seen before. But we can only see a few of the images, and that's because we're needing to overlap everything. Because we're going to be cutting away some of the image, we need the other one sitting underneath. We can't have each one in its own cell, because if we go away and sort of cut away the image, the background's going to show through where we want the image. Now, hopefully to help visualize, this is a layering that we're working with in our grid in there. So our panel container is then rotated and using absolute position, sort of positioned along the bottom whereabouts we want it, and we've rotated it a little bit and just sort of shimmied it down about where we want. Look, the details aren't super important. We've put it down there. So clip path is what's going to enable these shapes that we've wanted. When you add a clip path rule, in this case a polygon, we have an XY value for each of those things, and it makes its way around the shape, and that gives us the image. Now we can apply a clip path to each of our images, and then we've most of the way there with what we were doing. Now, again, we've got like all these random numbers on there, and you're probably thinking, this still doesn't look easier. But Firefox has given us some great tools here. The dev tools are really going to come in handy when you start doing some things like this. If you select the icon in there, you can start to move the nodes around yourself, and you can double click to add a new node and start to drag that. And you'll see the values are updating in the dev tools. So to create this, I was doing that in the dev tools and then copying that value across and adjusting as I need it. Now, for the white border, we can't use grid gap because everything's overlapping. So the box, the container has a white background, and then the same clip path is added to the image, but then just shrunk down a little bit. And because we're doing that, we need to slightly tweak the transform origin because we're dealing with some pretty funny shapes here. There's a lot of little adjustments you'll need to do when you start making shapes like this. But that's one of the downsides of the technique. You're going to have to manage the grid gap manually yourself. But there we go. We've recreated the shapes from that comic, which when you initially look at it, you would have thought there's no way we can do that sort of layout on the web. And if you haven't seen it yet, each of the links underneath are to the CodePen versions of each of these, so you can have a look at them and play, but I have another link at the end which will link to all of them. So clip path is no doubt a powerful tool when combined with grid. So we're going to have another example here, which is Detective Comics number 876. Taking the grid layering and from our earlier examples, we can recreate this same layout. The drawing's a little more intense, but it's the layout in the background we're going to focus on. Batman could be done by just the layering that we looked at before. The shapes can be recreated by adding perspective and rotating the panel. So we've added our grid, we're adding a panel to the grid in similar ways that we have before, and then we transform, we use some perspective, that gives us that nice little angle, and rotate it into that, and then the same with panel 2 all the way down. But you can see there's a problem here in that the blue background of each of them is coming through. We didn't want that. We wanted just the squares going down the page and sort of forming one shape. Again, we can use clip path here to cut out the part. Clip path is sort of showing the part that we do want visible. So you're not cutting out the stuff that you don't, you're making the part that you do want visible. But with each panel having a clip path on it, it gives the impression of a border going all the way down while giving us that shape. So it's, again, something quite interesting and different for the web. So there it is next to Mr. Batman. Now, clip path isn't limited to just polygons. There is a lot going on in these images, but we have flash on the side, and I particularly enjoy the cats up the top here. Looks like Two-Face to keep with our comic book thing. So we've got our polygons that we've seen, but there are some other options. Ellipse allows for oval shape. Again, the first two values are our radius, and then the X and Y allows us to offset it a little bit. And circle for a more uniform shape. Similar to ellipse, the first value is the radius, followed by the position, and we can have something else. So clip path affected the shape of the container, but we can also have the text react to the shape of the container as well, using CSS shapes. This is a panel from Saga, and the part that's important here is how the moon has its curve, or the planet, and then the text is also curving along that. Now, this has existed in magazines for a long time, but it's been absent from the web. But again, we'll do a little bit of setup here. We have our panel position relative because we're moving things about. Again, our paragraph, we shift it into place. And the important part here is our image, which we've moved to the side. We could have done this with Grid as well, the width and the height, but the shape outside is what we're interested in, the circle. So Firefox, again, has been helping us developers out with the dev tools. We can apply a shape outside and just use some values, but then we can select that icon and start resizing in real time. And I am certainly a visual kind of a learner, and I like to see things happening with code. Maybe that's why I prefer the front end. But we can see that, and we can take those values and we can move it back to our CSS. So it's really nice that the tools are helping us with this creative coding side of things. All right, didn't mean to skip, but we'll move on. The shapes can also be more complex than just circles. So there is definitely going to be a moment in your career where a designer comes to you and says, we've got a cat, and we need the text to wrap around it. And you go, I saw this once. And so we can use the polygon shape that we've had before, and we can draw around our cat, and we can do that. Now, we can also, which something that clip path didn't allow us, but shape outside does, is use an alpha mask. So if we have our cat, and then we have an alpha mask that represents the shape of our cat, very similar to a background image. We can say shape outside, URL, cat mask. There's some cause funniness in here, but that's boring. This is kind of what we're going to look at here, and you can look at the cause problems later. It needs to be on the same domain, essentially. So what we've created is a great example of the modern web, but it is based on a Western modern web. It's Western comics, styles, and structures. That's reading left to right, top to bottom. The structure and reading style isn't the only comic structure that exists, though. For instance, Japan has a very healthy industry with its manga. Now, I've been a particular fan of Naruto for a while, so it's fun again that I get to just keep putting all of my hobbies into this talk. But this is the same page from the manga in Japanese and in English. Now, even with the English one, we can see that the start is on the other side to what we're used to, and it finishes on the other side of there. But the English version, even though it's translated, they kept the layout the same. We could position the cells in our grid in this way quite straightforward, but we'll remember from before, the source order matters. So if we were to have alt text and everything on here, if we were to put it in that order, then the screen reader is going to read it somewhat backwards, more from the top down to the other side. Oops. So when placed into the grid with a left to right direction, we can do it like so. We'll have our first panel, second, third, through to the sixth. So similar to, at least in my experience, a reading style that I'm used to. Grid has us really well covered for internationalization. When direction right to left is applied, this can be in multiple places in the page, but I've done it directly here on the main. Grid just flips it to what right to left is. So panel 1 is now over to the side, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we've covered the accessibility by putting it in the correct order. We've added our grid, but then we've enabled other styles with a simple property. So of interest in this comic, you'll notice the difference in grid gaps. in the example. You can do that as well with grid gap. It doesn't always have to be consistent. In here, we're affecting the horizontal and the vertical gap. What's also worth noting in the manga is that the text runs vertically, but in English, it's left to right. Now, I didn't want to attempt to write Japanese, so I did it with English. And you do get a bit of a weird thing where the text runs that way. But with writing mode vertical right to left, it will go in the direction that someone like that would be expecting. With a logographic typeset, such as what Japanese has, that will work out correctly. Not actually sure why it does that with English, but I'm sure there's a really valid explanation. So that brings us to the end of our journey through the ages of comic and how they can be brought to the web. I mentioned at the start that although the examples are for comics, to think about how you can apply these to the projects that you're working on. And I hope the various effects that I've demonstrated have sort of sparked some ideas of something different that you can do with layout and taking it to the everyday products of the web. We've been in these layout boxes for quite some time, so imagine when you apply these layouts to your projects, sort of great things will start to happen. And that's why I believe we're now in the modern age of the layout on the web. CSS Grid gives us great new powers and flexibility with our layout. We saw how we could stagger content, layer our panels to create depth and interest. The coming CSS Grid Level 2 spec will give us the ability with Subgrid to align better across multiple panels. And getting a little more creative and breaking out of the layout box with CSS Shapes, Clip Path, and Shape Outside. Making our projects as accessible to as wide an audience as possible with Grid's great support for internationalization. I mentioned earlier that the code pens were all available. This is the URL where you can find them, and I also have it linked on my Twitter if you want to have a play around with those. In a talk setting, it can be hard to get through everything. Did you get the photo? Do you want me to go back? It can be hard to get through everything in a talk setting. So I've written blog posts that go through each one of those areas, and it goes into a lot more detail than what is possible in a talk. So that can be useful for you as well. So Stan Lee had a famous catchphrase he used to sign off letters and correspondence that he had with fans, which was Excelsior. And as a little bit of a hat tip, I thought it would be nice to include that in my talk as a closing. He's had a great effect on many in many creative industries. But after looking up its meaning, I sort of thought it was a really fantastic way to finish a talk. Excelsior stands for ever upward. So I think take what you learn from this talk and all the other great talks today and see how you can apply that to what you're working with. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for that amazing talk, Anton. We've got about 5 minutes for questions.
Hey, thanks for the presentation. It's really good. It's Mephisto in MCU.
What was that, sir?
It's Mephisto. It's going to be in MCU.
Don't know. I can't do any of their stuff on the web.
So I have a question. What would you advise is the best approach to take for somebody new to using something like CSS Grid?
Well, I mean, this is the way that I learnt CSS Grid. The talk is a little bit older now, but linking it with something that you enjoy, I think, is a good way to learn it. I kind of knew some of these comics and looked at the layouts, and I was trying to use Grid in products that designers would send me, but it was always trying to visualize something that I didn't quite understand yet, because the layouts that they were doing didn't have these grids and these structures to it. So taking a bit of a step back and starting to work with Grid with comics, in my case, was nice, because it could start off quite simple and then build up to our more advanced examples with the sort of breaking out the boxes and starting to combine those techniques together. So yeah, I would say link it with something that you enjoy doing.
I think that's good advice for everything, really.
Yes.
If there's no other questions, could we please have another round of applause for Anton? And it is now lunchtime. I'm sure everyone's hanging out for food.